We like to think that we have mapped every corner of our world, that the shadows have all been chased away by the glow of our satellites. But for as long as humans have gathered around fires, we have whispered about things that move just beyond the flickering light in the deep woods. Across the high, frozen silences of the Himalayas, a legend persists of a creature that belongs neither to the world of men nor to the animals. It is known as the Yeti, the abominable snowman, a shaggy titan of the frost that has haunted the collective human psyche for centuries. To some, it is a spiritual protector of the peaks. To others, it is a relic of an evolutionary path we thought had long since closed. In North America, a similar shadow falls over the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest, where the Sasquatch is said to roam the emerald gloom. From the Mapinguari of the Amazon to the Yowie of the Australian outback, the story of the wild man is a universal human constant. Why is it that cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of years of history all share the same vision of a giant, hairy humanoid? Is it possible that a branch of the primate family tree survived in secret, or is there something in our brains that needs these monsters to exist? Our journey into the mystery of the hidden giants begins not with a blurry photo, but with a fundamental question about the limits of our knowledge. For centuries, local communities in Tibet and Nepal have integrated the Yeti into their reality, treating it with a mix of reverence and practical fear. These aren't just ghost stories, they are cultural records of encounters with a physical presence that leaves massive, unidentified footprints in the high-altitude snow. Western fascination exploded in 1921 when Lieutenant Colonel Charles Howard Bury led an expedition to Mount Everest and found tracks resembling a human's, but much larger. The media back home coined the term abominable snowman, transforming a complex local tradition into a sensationalized global mystery that sparked decades of obsession. Professional mountaineers like Eric Shipton fueled the fire in 1951 by photographing a footprint so clear it seemed impossible to dismiss as a mere trick of the light. The print was nearly 13 inches long, with a distinct thumb-like toe pressed deep into the slush at nearly 20,000 feet above sea level. If these tracks are real, they suggest a creature with a mass and biological requirement that should be impossible to sustain in such a barren wasteland. To find the truth, we must move past the anecdotes and look at the hard evidence, starting with the physical remains locked away in mountain monasteries. Scalps, hands, and tufts of fur have been guarded by monks for generations, claimed to be the literal body parts of the Mogoi or Yeti. In the cold light of the 21st century, science finally has the tools to look at these relics and ask, what are you, really? In 2014, a team led by Professor Brian Sykes from Oxford University decided to settle the debate using the ultimate truth teller, DNA. They collected hair samples from around the world, including legendary relics from the Himalayas and sightings in the American wilderness. The results were both a cold splash of reality and a fascinating new mystery that no one had actually predicted. Most samples were mundane cows, horses, raccoons, and even a few humans who had inadvertently left their own traces behind. But two samples from the Himalayas matched an ancient DNA sequence from a polar bear jawbone dating back 40,000 years. This suggested a high-altitude hybrid, a specialized bear unknown to science, prowling the peaks and fueling the legends of the Yeti. While this mega bear theory offered a biological anchor, it didn't explain the bipedal, human-like descriptions that define the Sasquatch. To find a giant primate, we have to look back further in time to a creature that actually existed, Gigantopithecus blacki. Living in Southeast Asia until about 300,000 years ago, this was the largest ape to ever walk the earth. Standing nearly 10 feet tall and weighing over 1,000 pounds, Gigantopithecus was a literal king of the prehistoric jungle. Could a small population have survived the changing climate by retreating into the deep, inaccessible valleys of the Himalayas or Siberia? Evolutionary biology suggests this is unlikely, as large mammals require massive amounts of food and leave a significant ecological footprint. A breeding population of giants would need hundreds of individuals to avoid extinction, making it nearly impossible for them to remain invisible. Yet, the Lazarus effect reminds us that species we thought were dead for millions of years sometimes swim back into view. Consider the coelacanth, a prehistoric fish rediscovered in 1938, or the saola, a forest-dwelling unicorn found in Vietnam in 1992. If nature can hide a 4-foot-long fish in the ocean or a horned ox in the jungle, could it hide a giant? Skeptics point to the pareidolia effect, our brain's desperate need to find familiar patterns, like faces or bodies, in chaotic visual data. In the dappled light of a forest, a rotting stump or a bear standing on its hind legs easily becomes a monster. We are hardwired by evolution to see predators in the shadows because it was better to be scared of a stump than eaten. This psychological ghost haunts every blurry video and shaky eyewitness account, making objective truth as slippery as the mountain ice. If we move from the frozen heights of the Himalayas to the steaming humidity of the Amazon, the legend takes a darker, stranger shape. Here, the indigenous people speak of the Mapinguari, a terrifying giant with red fur, a second mouth on its belly, and a stench that paralyzes. While a belly mouth sounds like pure myth, paleontologists noticed a shocking similarity between the Mapinguari and an extinct giant, the ground sloth. Megatherium was a 6-ton beast, a titan that could stand on its hind legs to reach the high canopy. Armed with massive, curved claws, they were thought to have died out 10,000 years ago, but the descriptions of the Mapinguari match the ground sloth almost perfect. The belly mouth might actually be a scent gland, and the impenetrable skin matches the bony plates or osteoderms found in sloth fossils. This raises a haunting possibility. What if these legends aren't mythology, but long-term memory passed down through hundreds of generations? Oral traditions can be incredibly resilient. Some Australian Aboriginal stories accurately describe sea level rises from 7,000 years ago. Perhaps the Yeti and the Sasquatch are not living creatures today, but the echoes of a time when humans lived alongside giants. But if they are just echoes, why do we keep seeing them now in an age of high-definition cameras and ubiquitous GPS? The search for the wild man often reveals more about the searcher than the sought, driven by a deep-seated loneliness for the wild. In a world that is increasingly paved, manicured, and controlled, the idea of an untracked giant represents a slice of nature we haven't tamed. This is the woodwoes of medieval Europe, a wild man of the woods who lived outside the laws of God and the king. We seem to have a psychological slot in our minds reserved for a shadow cousin, a mirror image of ourselves that stayed in the garden. Anthropologists suggest these stories serve as a boundary marker, defining what it means to be civilized by showing us what is wild. But science isn't satisfied with metaphors. It demands physical evidence, and in the digital age, that evidence is harder to find than ever. Every year, thousands of people enter the woods with smartphones, yet the best evidence remains the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967. This 50-second clip of a female Bigfoot walking across a creek bed in California has been analyzed more than any other film in history. Biomechanists have studied the gait, the muscle ripples, and the compliant walk to determine if it's a man in a suit or something else. While many experts call it a clever hoax, others point out that the costume technology of the 1960s couldn't easily replicate those anatomical details. If a giant creature truly lives in the modern world, it must leave more than just footprints. It must leave a biological signature. Scientists are now using environmental DNA, or eDNA, to sample the air, water, and soil for genetic materials shed by living things. By filtering just a few liters of water from a remote mountain stream, we can detect every fish, bird, and mammal that has touched it. So far, eDNA surveys in Bigfoot hotspots have returned results for bears, deer, and rodents, but nothing that defies known taxonomy. This lack of physical evidence leads us to a crossroads. Either the creature is a master of evasion, or it simply isn't there. From a population biology perspective, a large primate needs a massive home range to find enough calories to survive the winter. In the snowy Himalayas or the high Sierras, food is scarce, and a 1,000-pound ape would be a walking calorie-burning machine. They would need to spend almost every waking hour eating, making them highly visible to the infrared cameras of modern wildlife biologists. Yet, the forest is a three-dimensional labyrinth, and we are constantly discovering that we aren't as observant as we think. In 2003, we discovered a new species of human, Homo floresiensis, on an island in Indonesia, though they had been gone for 50,000 years. These hobbits lived alongside modern humans, becoming part of local folklore as the Ebu Gogo, small forest people who stole food. If a tiny species of human could exist and leave a legacy in our stories, why couldn't a giant one do the same? The problem is one of detectability, the mathematical probability of finding a rare animal in a vast, complex environment. To a satellite, the forest looks like a solid green carpet, but underneath that canopy is a world of caves, ravines, and dead zones. Perhaps these creatures don't hide from us. Perhaps they simply exist in the spaces we are too loud or too heavy to enter. There is also the possibility of relict hominoids, small groups of Neanderthals or Denisovans that may have lingered in the deep valleys. Genetic testing shows that we carry their DNA within us, a ghostly union that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Our ancestors didn't just see these other humans, they lived with them, fought them, and eventually absorbed them into our own lineage. When we look for the Yeti, we might be looking for a version of ourselves that we lost a branch of the family that refused the city. This makes the mystery less about monsters and more about our own evolutionary loneliness as the last humans standing. Perhaps the most unsettling theory is that the wild man is not a physical animal at all, but a tulpa of the human collective. A tulpa is a concept from Tibetan mysticism, a being or object which is created through sheer spiritual or mental discipline. If enough people believe in a monster for long enough, does it begin to take a shape that we can all collectively see? This would explain why the evidence is always just out of reach. The blurry photo, the footprint that looks like a bear, the vanishing shadow. It is a ghost that we have collectively summoned to keep the world from feeling too small, too mapped, and too boring. We are a species that evolved in a world of giants, from mammoths to megalodons, and our brains might simply refuse to live without them. The abominable snowman and his cousins across the globe are the guardians of our wonder, the gatekeepers of the great unknown. Whether they are flesh and blood, a misidentified bear, or a memory of a long-lost ancestor, their value to us is the same. They remind us that despite our satellites and our sensors, the Earth still has secrets that it isn't ready to share with us. In the vast silent cathedrals of the Himalayas, the wind still howls with a voice that sounds suspiciously like a scream. In the deep, rain-soaked valleys of the Cascades, the trees still part for something heavy that moves without making a sound. We may never find a body, and we may never sequence a Bigfoot genome that satisfies the rigors of a peer-reviewed journal. And in a way, that might be for the best. A mystery solved is a mystery dead, and some mysteries deserve to live. If we ever truly found the Yeti, we would capture it, study it, and eventually put it in a cage or a textbook. The magic would evaporate, and the wild world would shrink just a little bit more, leaving us truly alone in the dark. So, we continue to look, peering into the shadows with our infrared cameras and our ancient, primal fears. We search for the giant not because we want to catch him, but because we need to know that he is still out there, free. The legend of the hidden species tells us that as long as there is a forest we haven't walked, there is still hope. So, the next time you find yourself at the edge of the deep woods, and the birds suddenly go silent, don't be afraid. Just remember that the world is much larger than our maps suggest, and some things are better left in the shadows.